Shavua Tov. Greetings for the new week. It's rainy and cloudy here in the DC area, but we have a special treat for all of the homebound today. America-Israel Friendship League is continuing this live webinar series from the homes of people around the United States and Israel. We launched this as part of the Friends in Deeds campaign 6 weeks ago, recognizing that we can't physically bring you to Israel, but maybe we could bring some Israel to you at home. Today, we're actually going to try to do a little bit of both. 3 months ago, when the New York Times travel section published their 52 places to go in 2020, it named Caesarea, Israel, the number 10 spot. And recently, they reflected on the challenge that not everybody's going to get to visit these 52 places. So they put up some virtual resources so that people could get a feel for these special places. So today, with thanks to our partners at Jewish Virtual Library, which is cited in the Times updated travel section, we created this live virtual tour with renowned tour guide Reuven Solomon, who has guided numerous AIFL delegations over 2 decades in Israel. We also have on the screen some of the AIFL delegation alumni from around the country, from Boston and from Oklahoma, who have participated in these tours, and they're going to help give a sense of what a virtual tour group would be today. And they're going to ask some questions directly to Reuven. For everyone on this call, whether you're on Zoom or you're on Facebook, we want to ask you to use your chat function to send a hello, tell us where you're calling in from and how you're feeling at this very moment. Give that some thought, grab your closest device, and feel free to send us your questions to Reuven throughout the webcast, and we'll try to get in as many as possible. For everyone on Facebook, please turn on your watch party button so your other friends who are just sitting around the house can join us live as well. Reuven, tell us where you are right now and where you're going to take us over the course of the hour.
Shalom Wayne, and I'm sitting by my computer in Kfar Vradim in the north of Israel. It's 7 in the evening here, and I'm delighted to be with you. It's so lovely to see and to know that there are many faces out there that are familiar to me. And I also want to welcome those first-timers who are joining in for the first time with me touring. And today, I want to take you on tour to one of my most favorite sites in Israel, Caesarea Maritima. We'll begin our tour with a walk through the ancient site of Caesarea that lay mainly in ruins. And we should have the first slide coming up now, showing us where we're going to be walking through. I will take you through the site, pointing out, now you should see it in front of you. This is an artist's concept of the way Caesarea, notice I said Caesarea, some people call it Ceasarea, and it can be spelt in English with a C, with a K. I've even seen it spelt with a Q, but there's only one correct spelling, of course, and that's the Hebrew spelling. And in the Hebrew spelling, it is the way it was named Caesarea for the Caesar, the Caesar, Augustus Caesar, when Herod the Great builds this site. The arrow you see points to the theater that we are actually virtually now standing outside of. And from that point, we're going to be walking through the theater, talking about what you're seeing on the way. We'll stop by the Bathhouse and Herod's Palace, where the arrow now is pointing. And we'll have a little bit of a chat about what that is and how it is one of the highlights, actually, to this day of Caesarea. And then from there, after having a glimpse from a distance at the Hippodrome, or the stadium, the chariot and sports stadium, where the arrow is now pointing, we will actually walk through it virtually, talking about how it operated in those days. Getting out of the stadium, we will actually walk into a different period of time as far as ruins are concerned. around there where the arrow is pointing now, we will walk through a Crusader entrance, a gate across a dry moat, because in a later period, as you'll hear in a moment, the Crusaders build an enormous fortress around the beautiful, magnificent harbor, artificial harbor that Herod builds, that you're seeing in the artist's concept in front of you. But we're going through to actually talk more about Herod's masterpiece, the harbor, than anything else. From that point, we shall head out of the Crusader fortress into Caesarea, where we will end our tour by an aqueduct that brings fresh water into Caesarea from 15 kilometers away. So we've got a lot of walking to do. I hope you've got the energy, and we will begin with Herod and his fantastic building of this Roman city in a place in the middle of, as you can see on this modern day map, Tel Aviv and Haifa. Of course, in those days, where Tel Aviv is now is where the ancient port of Jaffa was. And around where Haifa is, an old port of Dora. And those were the only two accessible ports coming into the shores of Israel for docking in comfortably. They were both uncomfortable ports because they had lots of stones, and sometimes cargo would have to be offloaded in rowboats. So Herod, when he decides that he wants to build a Roman city in honor of Augustus Caesar, and he realizes that he wants also to make a lot of money out of it, the most ideal place to build an artificial harbor is right between the two ancient harbors. And that's the logic for him having chosen that spot where an ancient town called Stratos Tower stood. He builds a Roman city to defy imagination, an incredible harbor, and it is well known as his masterpiece. Now, Herod the Great, we need to talk a few words about this man. Herod the Great, called the Great not because he was a great personality, but because he was a great builder. In fact, he was a terrible tyrant, and but his building was phenomenal. He builds the temple, rebuilds the temple in Jerusalem, and here in Caesarea, he builds the largest artificial harbor in the world of his time. Herod the Great dies in around 4 BC, and the Romans realize that none of his surviving sons, because the ambitious ones he got rid of, none of his surviving sons can really step into his shoes. And thus they send prefects to rule on behalf of Rome in the Judean, in the province of Judea. Now you should be seeing a slide of the stone that talks about the 5th prefect to be sent to Caesarea to look after Rome's interests in Caesarea, or Caesarea. And this is a major archaeological find. In fact, the only archaeological evidence of Pontius Pilate, dedicating a plaque and an area to Tiberium the emperor up top. And this places the right person in the right place at the right time. Pontius Pilatus, of course, very familiar name from the New Testament, because he was the prefect at the time of the crucifixion, and Tiberium was the emperor, the Caesar. Caesarea has a very strong link to Christianity, because not only the story of the crucifixion connected to Pilate, who actually lived in Herod's palace in Caesarea. That's the best place to live if you're on posting from Rome to Israel, to Judea. That would be a great place to live. But because of what happens after as well. The very first non-Jewish Christian comes from Caesarea. I say that because up until this point in history, first of all, you were a Jew, and then you became a follower of Jesus of Nazareth. And you may remember the debates between Shaul, Paul of Tarsus, the rabbi, and Simon Bar Yonah, Peter, as to how this should be opened up to the world. And it is due to a revelation that Simon Bar Yonah has on the rooftop of the house of Simon the tanner in Jaffa that calls him to Caesarea to meet up with a centurion, a God-fearing Greek, the New Testament tells us, and we can read about this in Acts 16, who wants to hear about this new sect of Judaism. And because of the revelation that Peter has had on the rooftop of Simon the tanner, Cornelius becomes the very first non-Jewish Christian in Caesarea and is baptized by Peter. Christianity continues its very strong link with Caesarea when Paul, or Shaul, the rabbi, is actually brought to trial and imprisoned in Caesarea. And it is from Caesarea that he heads out to Rome to spread the word. And once Christianity becomes the state religion of Rome, Eusebius writes his entire church history in Caesarea. And Helena, Queen Helena, Saint Helena, begins her journey identifying sites important to Christianity from after meeting Eusebius, the church historian, in Caesarea. In the next slide, you will see parts of the theater that we're standing outside of. And here I want to take a brief moment to just run through in headlines the history, so that when we walk through the rest of the site, I'll be able to almost telegraphically point out to you what period of history we're at and what we're looking at. Herod the Great, as I said, dies in 4 BC, and this begins the Caesarea as the seat of Roman government. You know, if you read the Talmud, the Megillah Tractate 6a, it speaks of, and I paraphrase here, that if someone tells you Caesarea lays in ruins and Jerusalem is flourishing, believe them. But if someone tries to tell you that Jerusalem lays in ruins and Caesarea is flourishing, believe them. But if someone tries to tell you that both Caesarea and Jerusalem are flourishing, do not believe them. What are they trying to tell us? Very simply, there could be no coexistence between Caesarea and Jerusalem, because Caesarea was the seat of Roman occupation and Jerusalem was the heart and soul of autonomous Judaism in the land. And there could be no coexistence. Where does this thought come from? In the very first part of Pilate's term in the land that begins in 26 AD, or CE if you prefer. As soon as he gets to Judea on Rome's behalf, he takes his accommodations in Herod's fabulous palace by the Mediterranean, and sends forces up onto the Temple Mount with emblems of the Caesar, Augustus, and the 10th Roman Legion, whose emblem was the wild boar, pigs on the Temple Mount. And this, of course, sends the Jews bananas in Jerusalem, and 2,000 of them march down a whole day's march to Pontius Pilatus's palace in Caesarea, sit down strike outside his palace. According to Josephus, Pilate says to the protesters, "Gentlemen, let's be civil about this. Let's go into the auditorium and we'll talk about it." Into the arena, which is, of course, the Hippodrome, the stadium that you're going to be seeing shortly. And there he has his soldiers draw their swords, and he threatens these protesters, "Go back quietly to Jerusalem or you're dead." Josephus writes that they lay on the ground baring their necks, saying, "Go ahead, kill us. You might as well. You've desecrated our most holy site, the house of the Lord." Pontius Pilatus relents. He promises to remove the statues and emblems and sends the Jews back to Jerusalem. Was it decency that moved him? We think not. Had he massacred in his first couple of weeks as prefect of Rome, Pax Romana, he would have been called up in front of Caesar very quickly, and he would lose this cherry of a post on the Mediterranean, beautiful climate, beautiful palace. So the Jews win that round. But there's another round coming up. Fast forward 40 years, and Florus is now the representative of Rome in the Roman province of Judea. And he is on holidays when the Jews in Caesarea, they were a minority. Caesarea had a majority Greek pagan population and a minority of Jews who had a synagogue in Caesarea. And Josephus writes that when they were on one Sabbath making their way to the synagogue through the Greek area, Greeks were sacrificing turtle doves on the top of upturned chamber pots in obvious mockery of the Jewish sacrificial practices in the temple. This causes a little bit of a riot, and a fight breaks out. And the Roman soldiers at first try to separate the forces, but in the end join the fight on the side of the Greeks. The Greeks set the synagogue alight, and the Jews race in, retrieving the holy scrolls from the synagogue, taking them to Nabata, a little distance away from Caesarea. Florus gets back from his holidays, and he imprisons the Jews who had taken the scrolls out of the synagogue to save them for having removed the scrolls without his permission. When word of this gets to Jerusalem, all hell breaks loose. This is 66 AD, and Caesarea was the spark that lit the Jewish war against Rome that ended up in the destruction of the Second Temple and of Jerusalem. So that's why the Talmud says what it says. We're standing outside the theater here, and as I said, it gives me a very brief chance to quickly continue this history that we're talking about. After the destruction of the temple, of course, Caesarea becomes a seat of the Romans, early Roman period. Later on, when Christianity takes hold in the Byzantine period, it becomes the very seat of Byzantium. 640, the Muslims conquer. In the beginning of the 12th century, the Crusaders come along and conquer and build the fortress that we spoke of. Following the Crusaders, we have Saladin and his conquest, 1187. Once again, the Pope in the mid 1200s, he was Innocent IV then, promises the kings of Europe that whoever shall rebuild the Crusader kingdom in the Holy Land will be raised to sainthood. And the King of France, Louis IX, takes the challenge. Louis comes to Caesarea, and he may or may not have placed a few stones back on the wall, and for that, he rises to sainthood, Saint Louis. After the Crusader takeover in the Second Kingdom, it is brought to a disastrous end with Baybars the Mamelukes in 1265. Caesarea is laid to ruins and lays neglected for decades. It is in the early Ottoman period that some Bosnian refugees are settled by the Turks in Caesarea. But with the advent of the First World War and the Turkish defeat, Caesarea, after becoming a very small fishing village, falls into ruins and history until modern times, when today it is slowly regaining some of its glory. As we stand here outside the theater gates, you notice two entrances. One is a blind alley, and the other is a way into the theater. These entrances are common with all Roman theaters, and they're called vomitorium. Now, don't be disgusted with it, because vomit, this wonderful Roman word, doesn't actually signify what is being expelled by force. It just means expelled by force. And you know, we think that the way it worked here is that this double entrance with one, a blind alley, had a double purpose. One, perhaps, for those who were lining up to buy at the box, would line up at the blind alley, buy their token or ticket, turn right, and then left into the theater, while those who had already prepaid could walk straight into the theater without having to line up to get their token for entry. But even more importantly, at the end of performance, it would release a bottleneck out of that way, and anyone standing outside the theater or those double doors would say, look at those people being vomited out of the theater, and hence vomitorium. We're going to take a little walk now through parts of the theater and end up with a short stop by the Herod's Bath. So,
Reuven, as we get ready to enter and walk around a little bit, I just wanted to share you have quite a global viewership here. We have people calling in from Kuwait and from Canada, and from Ian from Turks and Caicos, if that's how to pronounce it, which is probably also on the destination of places that you'd like to visit these days. I wanted to relay a couple of the questions that we've heard already. Just as we're entering one of the most exciting parts of the site itself, Sahi in Los Altos said it's one of his favorite places to visit in Israel. There was a question about this idea that you mentioned of Herod being in a place to build the temple. Is that something that was viewed as either acceptable or positive for him to do at the time?
Absolutely. Herod the Great in Jewish writings doesn't come out too well. He was a terrible tyrant, and he doesn't deserve to come out too well. He murdered his own sons. So the Talmud doesn't have much good to say, or the Mishnah or other writings. But the one good thing that they do say about his works is that if you have not seen Herod's temple, you have never seen a beautiful building in your life. So he was given praise, and it was considered a good thing that he rebuilt the temple, but certainly did not absolve him from his other behaviors.
Okay, so go ahead and take us through, and then I'm going to turn to some of our alumni of our delegations to ask you a couple of questions live as we move through this next section of the site.
Wonderful. Well, you're looking at the seating here of, I have to tell you, a very rebuilt theater. How come rebuilt? Because the good seats, limestone, were dragged away and reused, recycled, and thus much of the seating, you can see some of the original seats, and you can tell by the color here in this video that's about to start. You can see that some of the actual original seats remain, the ones that were not incomplete and broken, but the rest were rebuilt on the foundations, the original foundations, of course. And today, you may be surprised or not surprised to hear that Israeli performers really are privileged by performing in Caesarea, considered the highlight of a performer's popularity if he's invited to perform to an audience in Caesarea. So to this day, that theater is being used. So the video should start in a moment, and when it does, we'll walk through the site. The video's not playing? Here we go. Now, as we swing around, you're looking at the beautiful Mediterranean. But I have to tell you that in the time of the operation of this theater in ancient times, that's not the view you would have had. There would be a scanner front, a stage front, totally blocking out the view, and you'll see this in the rebuilding of the theater in a moment. As we leave the theater, we walk through the graveyard of some of the elements that were used in this stage front called the scanner fronts, 3 stories high sometimes, right to the height of the top seats. And here you see the scattered pillars that created this screen, the scanner fronts of the theater. And now we're looking where the scanner fronts should have been. And underneath that stage, I need to tell you that there are change rooms for the actors still in place today, and still used today, incidentally, for the performers. We are now walking towards Herod's palace and gardens. And before we actually enter, we're going to have a look across the water to the harbor area. We're looking here at the southern harbor area, that promontory that you see there, that Herod the Great builds. And we're looking here through the length of the Hippodrome. We're going to be stopping and talking about the Hippodrome shortly, but as we swing back from the Hippodrome, we will be going towards the Bathhouse. And the movie has stopped for I don't know what reason, but let's have a look. The video should continue and take us back to the Bathhouse. There we go. Coming back to where we started from as we had a look down the Hippodrome. And we walked past the replica of Pilate's stone, we call it the Pilate stone. It's a replica. The original is in the Israel Museum, but this is a very exact replica. And one can see the real stone in the Israel Museum. As I said, the only hard archaeological evidence placing the right man in the right place at the right time, Pontius Pilatus. And here is what we walked up to, slowly but surely coming into view, is the beautiful floor of what was a superb freshwater bathhouse that Herod the Great built on top of the sea, the Mediterranean. How did he get fresh water? He was a genius. He tapped down into the coastal aquifer to supply a beautiful bathhouse with fresh water. Now, we'll continue to the next slide to see a rebuilt artist concept of the theater that you're seeing there. And now you see what I meant when I said that one could not see the Mediterranean as a spectator in those days because of the scanner fronts. In the next slide, we're going to have a look at what the bathhouse floor looked like, and then head to the auditorium. This is the artist's concept of the bathhouse. Beautiful construction, fresh water in 2 rooms through Herod's palace and gardens. And of course, you can make out the theater in the top left-hand corner and the stadium, Hippodrome, in the bottom left-hand corner. In the next slide, we shall actually have a look at the stadium and talk a little bit about it. In the next slide, please. Yes, here we see the northern end of the stadium with seating. And the seating you see goes around on both sides. But wait a minute, on the Mediterranean side, the seats are gone. What happened? Earthquake, tsunamis, and those seats, some of them are still there, swept out to sea. And when you look through the water and to the waves, you can see where the seats that were in all the way, the length of this sports stadium, Hippodrome, swept away with the right-hand side, the left-hand side, I'm sorry, the eastern seats intact all the way, almost all the way to the end of the Hippodrome where Herod's Harbor area begins. Now notice the center with a sort of a what is called a spinner, a turning point. And notice across from the turning point, a wooden platform. The wooden platform was the VIP platform. The spectators there in the photo are sitting beside that wooden platform. There the VIPs would sit and watch the races, horse-drawn chariots tearing around, making 7 rounds of because there was another spinner at the other end, making 7 rounds of the stadium. And guess what each round was measured in Roman measurement? A furlong. To this day, 7 furlong races are extremely popular. In this slide, what you're looking at is from modern times, where on certain festivals, Caesarea comes alive again with spectators. And now you see what I meant when I said the seats go all the way down to the very starting point of the stadium and around on the Mediterranean side as well. But here you see something curious. All of a sudden, the seats end and there's a building jutting out into the Hippodrome. This is a later development when the Hippodrome, the sports stadium, is converted into a blood sports stadium in the early Roman period, a blood sports stadium to entertain the crowds with gladiators and so on. To this day, underneath the seats that you see where the last spectators in this photo are sitting over, there is an entrance into an area where under the seats, cells, 2 enormous cells were kept for the gladiators, and outside the stadium itself, beyond the fence you see where that person, the last person there standing up at the last of the spectators, iron cages with the animals that would be released into the stadium after it was turned into a blood sports stadium. Now, Herod, this is a little bit of trivia that might be of interest to you, but Herod the Great was the one who held sports games in that Hippodrome once every 4 years, and it should sound familiar, but he was the very first person that we know of in history who instituted 3 prizes for the contestants: gold for the winner, silver for the second place, and bronze for the third. And that practice has continued to this day. We're going to continue with the next.
Reuven, I may use the sporting opportunity to pass off to Jody on the panel, who I know is a marathoner and gets out and runs when she's visiting clients around the world. I know Israel was a fun place for you, Jody, to run around. What's on your mind looking at these places, which I know you visited when you were with the AIFL influential women's delegation that visited just a couple years ago?
Well, what I have to say, Reuven, thank you so very much. This is what a wonderful way to spend a Sunday. So thank you so very much for this tour. It's one of my favorite things to do every morning whenever I'm in another country is to get up and run. And people were always so concerned where you're going to be in Israel, like, what are you doing going for runs? You're going to stay in the gym. And I really did get up every single morning and I went for a run. It's a great way to see and understand how Israel is waking up. And it was fantastic. One of the things that I was like wondering was, you have the stadium, the auditorium. What kind of performances were happening at that time? How were they selected? Who were the individuals that were allowed to come? Because you have people from all different economic societies that are in that time. Who was able to come to the programs? Who was able to perform? Was it all females? Was it all males? This is such a loaded question, but as you were talking, all these things were coming in my mind, and I was just dying to know, how were these shows promoted and seen?
I assume that you're talking about performances in the theater, Jody.
Yes, yes.
Excellent. Well, unlike the Greeks, who in their theater had highbrow educational tragedies, comedies sometimes, and proper shows, the Romans from Herod's time and onwards had cheap entertainment. Roman nymphs in bathtubs on the stage, slapstick comedy. This was a show for the masses. The shows, incidentally, were not 1 hour, 2 hour, or 3 hour shows. They sometimes went for days. And this was a way to distract the masses from criticizing and waking up to what was happening around them. So it was cheap entertainment for the masses.
So was it used for political purposes? Again, you just said to keep people from...
As a distraction, to distract the masses from worrying about the stuff they should really be worrying about.
Well, in that respect, we've been looking for a distraction as well. So maybe the tradition has continued. Reuven, Jason, well, we have people, Joy has written in from Utah, and Jason, I'm not sure where he's from, but his comment was, "Dude, you were my tour guide a number of years ago," with an exclamation point. So why don't we continue with the tour? We'll stop again for Piper and Sherry if you want to ask questions on the next stop. Let's head back to the tour.
Excellent. What I'm going to suggest here is that instead of stopping at the later Roman bathhouse because of time running ahead of us, we will head straight to the highlight, and that is the entrance into Herod's Harbor via the Crusader Gate. And that you will find in slide 17 as we head to the video, the fourth video I'd like to show you, heading into the Crusader Gate and Herod's Harbor. Wonderful. Here's the Crusader Gates over a drawbridge that heads into the harbor area that had been surrounded by the building much, much later, of course, of a massive Crusader fortress. The vaults you can see on the right-hand side, not the ones in front of you, they're modern, but on the right-hand side, were the warehouses. The grass you see in front of you was the private harbor. The water came in Herod's harbor, the water came right up to these vaults that you see there that were the warehouses, the grass, the private harbor, the VIP harbor, and the rest of it beyond, which you're going to see in a moment, the general harbor of Caesarea. Now, Caesarea had, I suppose you could in a way call it a sort of the harbor area, Sebastos, which incidentally is Greek for Augustus. Once again, the harbor, Herod's jewel on the crown, he dedicates to his patron, Augustus Caesar. And here you see the entrance, very eroded, of course, that lead up to the higher point of Caesarea, where Herod builds the temple to Roma, the Roman goddess, and in there he has a statue for Augustus as well. And here we are approaching, by short clicks, the harbor area. Now, what you're seeing here are just remnants. Straight across the view, you'll see a building with some flags. That today serves as a diving club where one can actually rent equipment and take a guide down and way out to sea. If you see the promontory there and you might see a man or something standing right at the end of it, that's not even half of Herod's harbor. The harbor goes far further out, and you're going to see how much further out in the next slide that will give you an aerial view of the harbor. What you're looking at is an actual aerial view of today. Down at the bottom of the slide, you're seeing the dark shadows deep in the water that are the remnants of the breakwater that Herod the Great built. The promontory that you see sticking out, as I said, was halfway of the harbor that you can view today, and the other half was way out to sea. You know, Josephus writes something that puzzled us for many centuries. He writes that Herod the Great, when he builds his artificial harbor, incidentally the largest harbor, artificial harbor in the world, larger than Piraeus, Josephus writes. He writes that Herod places 600-ton and 500-ton stones, that the weight we get by the measurement he gives us, 6 meters long and 5 meters wide and 5 meters high, blocks of stone to lay down on the seabed to build a harbor. And we say, come on, Josephus. There is no known method to man to this day that we know of how a quarried block of stone can be taken out to sea and placed in a position like that. In the next slide, I'm going to show you a different view of the same harbor that will give you a perspective of the size of the harbor. And in this slide, now in front of you, an artist's concept of what the harbor would have looked like, with the lighthouse, the towers guiding the ships through into the major part of the harbor, and then into the private harbor. You can see up on top of the hill the temple to Roma and Augustus, and it was a glorious harbor, and one of the reasons that Caesarea was called Herod's masterpiece. But wait a minute. What is this mystery of how these blocks of stone can be placed so far out to sea? Well, actually, as late as the 1950s, underwater archaeological excavations uncovered Herod's secret. The secret was, And if we can look at the next slide, you will see how he was able to do it. What you're looking at here is a construction in works, an artist's concept of how and the way things were constructed. But the box you see in front of you is a large raft with wooden walls. This is one of the methods that Herod the Great used. This large raft with wooden walls would have rubble, lime, and volcanic ash mixed into it to give it stability on the water, and it would start to sink in the water, but when still possible, would be towed out to where Herod wanted it to be for his breakwater, anchored there, and rowboats with this volcanic ash, lime, and rubble would go back and forth, filling this box until it was so full that it would bloop, sink down to where it was needed. The salt water and the seawater and this mix, the marine cement, creates these blocks. One of the reasons the harbor deteriorated over the years is that the rubble that Herod used, what he had available close by, was kulka, sandstone rubble. And that's very erodible, I'm sorry. And in this method, and in other methods as well, of double-walled boxes, Herod the Great was able to create a breakwater that made up the most beautiful artificial harbor in the world, making him, I would say, the Bill Gates of his time, making him a wealthy man, because everything that was coming from the Far East, from Africa through to Europe, would come through the hands of Herod the Great, and taxes. It made him a very wealthy man.
Reuven, I'm gonna take a question or two while we still have the opportunity. I'm going to turn to Piper first in Oklahoma, who I know has visited Caesarea and has a question for you. Go ahead.
Hi, Reuven. This is incredible to see all of this from my dining room. I've been out to Caesarea several times. I've been to Israel 10 times, and I've visited Caesarea each time I've been, but I've never seen the artist's rendition before. And so that was really eye-opening to see how big and bustling the city really was back in the day. I understand that Paul was imprisoned there at one point. Was he imprisoned there in that harbor area, or where would they have held him? And I also, it's my understanding that he was questioned in the theater. Is that a true statement? Do we know?
Because first of all, I'll start with the last question: theater or not? Because for centuries, right up until as late as the early 80s, we did not realize or did not uncover the Hippodrome. It was a beach. It was sand. There were banana plantations on top of it, and thus everyone assumed the theater must be the place where all these things happen, where the trial would take place, where, in fact, later you may remember in 135 AD, where Rabbi Akiva was martyred, and some people say up to 25,000 Jews and early Christians were massacred and tortured and so on. And everyone assumed, well, it has to be the theater. And in fact, with Pontius Pilatus inviting the protesters from Jerusalem, you said, wait a minute, 2,000 people in the theater and have them surrounded by swords. And then we discovered the Hippodrome, right outside Pilate's palace. So it was the Hippodrome, or part of the Hippodrome, where that would have been used, in fact, even for the trial of Paul, a larger area just outside Herod's palace, which was, of course, Pontius Pilatus's palace in his time. And The first question is where Paul would have been imprisoned. There is an area that was dedicated later by the Byzantine Christians between the theater and the harbor, above, on the other side, above the Hippodrome, where Roman warehouses, Bathhouse, and other housing was, where there is a room that is thought to be, because of the Byzantine, there's no one can guarantee it, of course, but because of the Byzantine or Byzantine, you might pronounce it, inscription is where Paul was most likely held.
Reuben, let me try to get another question from Sherry, who's competing with 2 barking dogs and a 10-year-old, not necessarily in that order, but had a question before you get into your final couple of slides to wrap up. Go ahead, Sherry. Whoops, we need you.
There we go. Hi, Reuben.
Hi, lovely to see you.
Oh my gosh, it is so nice to see you. I saw the excitement in Jody's face too, and Piper, when you said something, it took me back to our trip in 2018. It was just the tone in your voice. It was just the excitement about sharing this with us. I don't really have much of a question. I just want to say thank you, because I think that this is just an amazing opportunity as we sit here where we are right now in this world with COVID-19 having such an incredible impact on so many of us. To be able to join you today in Israel, I hold that trip in such high regard. I hope I don't get emotional. You have no idea the impact that you and the other folks from the America-Israeli Foundation, or Friendship League rather, have had on my life. And I just want to share that with you and everybody that's watching today. It's such an incredible organization, and the trip to Israel was just, it was life-changing. And so I thank you. It's just nice to be on this journey with you today.
Thanks for sharing.
Thank you very much. It's been an absolute privilege
Thank you.
To see you all again. It's
thank you.
But we've got to stop this virtual business and get back to the real stuff.
I'm ready to come back anytime.
Yeah, Reuben, we're going to need your last slide or two to wrap up, because time is running, as it often does in these places that have thousands of years of history. But go ahead.
Excellent. We can actually go through the last 3 slides, or the second last and the last. Here we are. The Crusader Gate that we're going out of, very fortified, as you can see. This is the entrance from the east. Impossible to crash through the gate because it would have a drawbridge across a dry moat. And thus, the way these fortresses would have to be undermined would be underneath the dry moat. I know we're pressed for time, so we can go now to the last slide, where I would like to the next one, where I would like to, and this slide incidentally is from the JVL, the Jewish Visual Library, where you'll find other material on Caesarea. This is the 15-kilometer long aqueduct that brought from the Shuni Springs in the Carmel Mountains fresh water all the way into Caesarea. Unfortunately, because of earthquake and tremors and time, this section survives, and other sections in pieces survive. But the aqueduct coming into Caesarea, because of earth movement and the rising sea, has disappeared. But what you're seeing here is a real testament to Roman engineering, where a very, very gradual slope brought the water in from 15 kilometers away in an internal pipe. The people standing up there were standing on top, but in an internal pipe, fresh water all the way into Caesarea. So for many reasons, Caesarea is known as Herod's masterpiece, and perhaps the shining jewel of all of Caesarea was his incredible harbor. Folks, It's been an absolute pleasure to be with you. And as I say, the sooner we get out of this visual mode, virtual mode, and go into the real water bottle and walking shoes mode, the better.
All right, everybody, you've got to somehow find the sandals, somehow find your walking shoes and your canteen and everything that you need for the actual tour and to go. There's been such an outpouring of love today, Reuven, from people who you guided, and Sherry's comments, and Tatiana and Jody's just smile that started us as a reminder. So thanks for giving us the distraction. You did it a lot better than Herod did. We do want to acknowledge that this is a tough period, and as part of our community building efforts we launched this Friends in Deeds campaign. We're announcing today our 5th $500 donation of Israeli foods and treats to vulnerable communities and frontline medical staff that are battling COVID-19. This week, we're sending our package of goodies assembled at the Barsadeh family compound in Pennsylvania to the University of Texas MD Anderson Cancer Center in Houston, whose personnel have been asked to treat COVID-19 patients as well as their cancer patients, and they've even converted a part of their medical campus specifically for that purpose. So we recognize that there are people today on the front lines, and really one of our intentions as part of this series is not only to provide us at home a little bit of relief and a break from quarantine, but to acknowledge that there are vulnerable people and there are people serving them in heroic ways. So this is our way of providing just a little bit of a break for those heroes amongst us. Each week we're asking friends and partners in this community to help us identify other medical personnel who might appreciate a boost of support coming from Israel in this forum. So on your screen you saw there are various addresses you can submit a nomination. And we did have some questions from people who don't live in Caesarea, who wanted to have access to these materials and the videos. We will be sending that out to all the participants, both on a link on our website, and for those of you here on Zoom, we'll send out a link to you as well. By the way, we do have someone calling in, Howard Goodman from Caesarea, who sent out a shout out. So we really have brought the virtual and the physical together as advertised. Last advertisement from us is, many of you know, this week is a special day in Israel and for Friends of Israel around the world with Yom Ha'atzmaut. So on this Wednesday, the 29th at noon Eastern time, we will share a special presentation from the Israel Opera with a concert in honor of Israel Independence Day with amazing songs from Israel's history. And it'll be a real treat for all of you. So if you're sitting at your seat, if you're tied somewhere in the middle of all these Zoom calls and phone calls and barking dogs and when Amazon arrives, if all that's happening at 12 o'clock on Wednesday, take a break, listen to some amazing music in the background and hear voices of joy and support, even in this time of crisis, that we recognize we do need to take these breaks and remind us of our humanity, remind us of the spirit of Israel, and remind us of the great miracle of the independence of Israel on Independence Day. So I'll say in advance, Hag Sameach and Yom Ha'atzmaut Sameach to everybody. Thanks for joining us. We look forward. We're doing these and we'll continue to do them. So please share it with your friends, and we look forward to seeing you on a future webinar like this. Have a great rest of the week.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
And next year in Jerusalem, right?
Next year in Jerusalem.